Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about federalism, and we're going to talk about how power flows through our federal system of government. So far in American government or in Pod A, we've talked a little bit about what government is, what government does, some of the building blocks, if you will, of what a government has to consist of. And we've talked a little bit about that distribution of power. So you should have read already about the difference between systems in which power flows through government. In your book, it talks about unitary systems of government, it talks about confederal systems of government, and it talked about a federal system of government. And that's what we're talking more about today. So we're kind of expanding on those ideas that were presented in chapter 2. So remember, a federal system of government is when the Constitution has divided the power between the national government and between regional governments, or in our example of the United States, the state governments. So that national government has some fixed responsibilities or powers, and the regional or state governments have other responsibilities. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those things today and how that power flows through that system. Remember that a federal system of government is most likely to be adopted in a larger country with a diverse population. So it works here. And as we talk about in our next unit, when we go a little bit deeper into the history of our nation and how we got to the point of the Constitution, the colonies all had very different interests and things that were important to them. So federalism allowed for there to be a national government where there could be some unity and there was protection of the nation overall, but then it also allowed the states to have some individual powers and responsibilities and things that were representative of the needs or wants of that particular state. So there's a great advantage in this system in the flexibility that it gives those states in meeting the needs of their differing populations. And there is likely different needs in Minnesota than there is in Texas. But the downside of that flexibility is that there are different laws from state to state, and oftentimes we see conflicts with that. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as well. So what is federalism? Basically, the definition of federalism is it's a system of government where that power is divided between federal government and state governments. So everything that I just kind of described to you. We have our national federal government, and we have 50 different state governments. The federal government has a set of powers and responsibilities that are laid out to them in the Constitution. The states also have powers and responsibilities that are laid out to them in their own unique state constitutions. And we'll talk about that in this unit as well. So that power is divided up. How is that divided? Again, federal or national government has something that we call delegated powers or expressed powers. Means that the Constitution grants those powers. They are specifically stated in the Constitution. So when you think of an expressed power, it's being expressed in the Constitution by actually being stated out. And you can find all of the expressed powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And those are powers of Congress. And it's laid out very specifically what Congress, as part of the national government or representatives of the national government, what Congress has the ability to do. And those are laws and powers that impact our entire nation, so all 50 states. State powers are referred to as reserved powers. There are powers not granted to the federal government that are reserved for the states. And that power is granted to the states in the 10th Amendment. So again, in the Constitution, clearly stated powers that are not granted to the federal government or denied to the states are reserved powers. There are also concurrent powers in a federal system. So there's going to be those powers that both the state and the national governments have. I'm frozen here. Hold on one second, everybody. Please bear with me. There we go. So some examples of expressed powers we're going to get to in 1 second. Again, just to kind of reiterate, express powers written out in the Constitution found in Article 1, Section 8. Some examples of that are taxes. The power to tax is a unique example because this is a concurrent power as well. Those of you that have a job and get a paycheck know very well the ability of both the national and the state governments to tax. So when you get your paycheck and you look at your pay stub, you can see that there are taxes that are taken out going directly to the federal government, and there are also taxes that go to the state. You learned about in chapter 1 as those building blocks of government. In order for government to exist, there has to be a means of revenue. There has to be a way to collect revenue. We do that as a nation through taxes. So as citizens, we pay taxes. That revenue goes to the governments, and the government is able to provide us with certain things, those public goods that were talked about before. Another example of an expressed power is not wanting to come up again. To maintain an armed forces. So one of the expressed powers in Article 1, Section 8 is the power of the federal government to have a military, to have those armed forces, and they have the ability to send them into action when needed. The power to coin money is another example that is, again, expressed in the Constitution and given to the national or federal government. Again, if you think about it, we have one currency that we use, and that currency is good in all 50 states. It's a nationwide federal currency. Imagine how confusing it might be if every state was allowed to coin their own money. You would have to change over currency in every state that you traveled to. Every time you drove over the border to Wisconsin, you'd have to have a different type of currency. Think about if you've ever traveled to Europe, where some of the countries, at least until the euro, operated with different currencies. Okay, it can be challenging. Reserve powers are, again, powers that are granted to the states by the 10th Amendment. So these are the things that are not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, so not given to that national federal government. These are going to be more individual powers that the state is allowed to have the ability to do. So education is a big one. And this is often misunderstood because there is federal money or dollars that is often given to education. But the primary revenue source of funding education is the states. State taxes and state governments are what fund education, public education systems. So every state has its own graduation requirements potentially, or state standards for what content you learn in your math class and your social studies classes and your English classes. So education is a reserved power. Voting and elections, another thing that we are often unaware of. Voting and elections are not a federal power. We do not have a standard ballot. Every state is allowed to have their own ballot. Every state is allowed to set their own rules and restrictions on voting, whether you need an ID to vote, what time the polls are open, again, what the ballot is going to look like, what the procedures are to register to vote. So we have some very specific requirements for voting in all states, like you have to be 18, you have to be registered. But the other things are all left up to the states, and the actual process of conducting the election and counting the ballots is up to the states. So when we talked about before sort of the benefits and drawbacks, I mentioned on at the very beginning of this presentation, although federalism is a great thing that allows kind of the protection of the nation and it provides unity, it can also become a downside in that this is a really great example. When we've got competing laws from state to state on voting and elections, it can make something like voting really confusing for people. Here's another quick list of some other things that are reserved powers. Marriage laws, alcohol sales, courts and local government are all, again, regulated, and laws and rules decided by the states. So there's a concurrent power in terms of like laws themselves and how we punish law breakers. There are federal laws and there are state laws, so they're concurrent in that sense. But the majority of laws that you have to follow on a regular basis, speed limit laws and kind of traffic violation sort of things, laws about property use, laws about crime that impact us the most on a daily basis, that's going to come from the states. Fire and police protection is another big one. It's important to have. It provides us a sense of safety and security, but that is something that is funded for and provided by the states. So there might be different rules and requirements there. Another thing that's not listed, license requirements. So your driver's license requirements, hunting and fishing license requirements. Again, those are all set up for by the states. So just a reminder that concurrent powers are powers that both the national and state governments can use. So although there are things that are separate, they've divided that power up between the national government and the state governments. There are some things that kind of are in the middle and that overlap. So think for a second about powers that both the state and federal governments have. I've mentioned one to you already when we talked about taxes. Okay, so taxes are definitely a concurrent power. Some other examples or shared powers are concurrent. If we look at this Venn diagram, maintaining law and order, again, like I kind of mentioned before too, crimes and laws, we have federal laws, we have state laws. Highways, we have interstate highways that go between the states, and then you have your state and local highways. So there is some money spent on infrastructure at both the federal and the state level. The ability to borrow money, the ability to have a bank and establish courts, constructing and maintaining roads, providing for public safety, protecting public health. All of those are things that both national and state government have the power and the ability to do. There are also, if we go back to those express powers for a second, the ones that are in the Constitution, along with those express powers, there is something called an implied power. Implied powers are implied by the expressed powers. There is something in Article 1, Section 8 called the Necessary and Proper Clause that gives Congress the power to make all laws that are needed to carry out any of those powers that we already talked about as being expressed. So, for example, we talked about how Congress has the power to maintain armed forces. That is an expressed power in the Constitution. The implied power that goes with that is the ability to implement a draft. So because Congress and the national government have the ability to maintain those armed forces, if they need troops in a time of war, they have the ability to implement a draft without having to create another law. It's implied by that expressed power. Another example is Congress's ability to tax. That expressed power that gives the national government the ability to tax also gives them the power to create the IRS, or the Internal Revenue Service. They needed a way to collect those taxes and determine what happens if someone doesn't pay their taxes. So that system of the IRS has the ability to collect those taxes, to maintain different rules and laws accordingly, and that's implied by that expressed power. So just to kind of wrap up a review, remember that there are benefits and drawbacks to that federal system. Federalism is that division of power between the national and the state government. It's going to promote national unity while allowing for some diversity among the states. It's also going to allow the states to operate as laboratories for public policy as they see things fit for their own state and they feel that it's going to benefit their state or provide revenue for their state. There is some flexibility to allow the states to do those things. Just remember that the downside or the drawbacks is that there's often a lack of consistency of laws and policies from state to state. And we'll look at that and talk about that a lot in this class, especially when it comes to election and voting. There can be problems when you have inconsistency from state to state. Same thing in the justice system. Crimes, laws, and policies, when they differ from state to state, can sometimes create inequities amongst groups of people and challenges to that. So I hope today you learned a little bit about federalism. Our next presentation is going to look a little bit more specifically at state governments and how the power is organized in that system.